When the message arrived at 10 Downing Street, Winston Churchill didn't reach for his cigar. He didn't offer a witty remark for the history books. He stared at the paper until the ink seemed to burn into the mahogany desk. The report shouldn't have been possible. It defied every memo, every map, and every direct order issued from the Supreme Command. For months, the world's most powerful men had been playing a high-stakes game of chess with the map of Europe. They had a plan, a sequence, a carefully curated victory that would look good in the newsreels and even better at the peace conferences. But one man had just lit a match and dropped it onto their gasoline-soaked blueprints. Churchill looked at his closest aide and said something that would never appear in his multi-volume memoirs. It was a sentence born of pure, unadulterated dread. At that moment, the Prime Minister realized that the biggest threat to the British Empire wasn't the enemy in front of them. It was the ally who was moving too fast. But to understand why a victory felt like a catastrophe, we need to rewind 48 hours. In early 1945, the atmosphere in the Allied High Command was one of supreme, almost arrogant confidence. The war was won. The only question left was how the trophy would be divided. Churchill had a vision for the end of the world. He saw a disciplined, orderly march into the heart of Germany. Every bridge, every river crossing, and every city was already assigned to a specific general. It was a bureaucratic masterpiece. Field Marshal Montgomery, Churchill's golden boy, was the designated hero of this final act. And he was the one meant to cross the Rhine, the last great barrier, in a massive, coordinated display of British might. The plan was called Operation Plunder. It involved over 1 million men, thousands of artillery pieces, and a meticulously timed paratrooper drop. It was meant to be the most photographed, most celebrated moment in military history. Churchill believed the situation was stable. The maps were clear. The intelligence confirmed that the Germans were waiting for the hammer to fall exactly where Montgomery had pointed it. What none of them realized was how wrong that assumption was. Because while Churchill and Montgomery were polishing their boots for the cameras, a storm was brewing in the south. A storm wearing ivory-handled revolvers and a helmet polished to a mirror sheen. Then the reports stopped lining up. At the headquarters of the Third Army, George S. Patton was doing something the High Command hadn't authorized. He was moving. But he wasn't just moving, he was disappearing from the radio nets. In London, Churchill began to see glitches in the daily briefings. A small town in the south, nowhere near the planned crossing site, was suddenly reported clear of the enemy. Then another. Then a bridgehead was mentioned, then retracted. One detail didn't match the rest: Patton's fuel consumption. It was skyrocketing, yet his official reports claimed he was holding defensive positions. Churchill's staff ignored it at first. They assumed it was typical Patton bravado, noise meant to distract from Montgomery's upcoming glory. They thought Patton was stuck in the mud of the Eifel Mountains, miles away from the water. They believed the leash was short enough to hold him. That decision would haunt them, because while the great men were debating the politics of the post-war world, Patton was standing on the banks of the Rhine, looking at a river that he had been told he wasn't allowed to cross yet. Instead of slowing down to wait for orders, Patton doubled down. He knew that if he asked for permission, the answer would be no. The political optics of the war demanded that the British cross first. So Patton did the unthinkable. He ordered a total radio blackout for his lead elements. He was effectively going rogue in the middle of the largest war in human history. In London, the tension was becoming physical. Churchill was pacing. He could feel the momentum shifting. If Patton crossed now, it would humiliate Montgomery. It would shift the balance of power within the alliance toward the Americans. It would ruin the orderly transition of power Churchill had spent years negotiating with Stalin and Roosevelt. Pulling Patton back now would admit something worse, that the Allied command had lost control of its own most effective weapon. That's when the situation crossed the point of no return. On the night of March 22, 1945, without a single shot fired in a preliminary barrage, without a single paratrooper, and without a single camera crew present, Patton's men slipped into the water. Behind closed doors, when the confirmation finally hit Churchill's desk, hours before Montgomery was scheduled to begin his own grand crossing, the Prime Minister's reaction was not one of Allied pride. It was a cold, piercing realization. He knew Patton hadn't just crossed a river. He had shattered a political glass ceiling. Churchill turned to his advisors and whispered a truth that was never meant for the public. He admitted that they were no longer the masters of the European theater. He realized that the American cowboy had just proven that the British strategy of cautious, methodical warfare was obsolete. Churchill saw the writing on the wall. He realized that Patton wasn't just fighting Germans, he was racing the clock to ensure the Americans dictated the peace. But he didn't say it out loud, not yet. He had to maintain the mask of the United Nations. He had to pretend this was all part of the plan. But in his private diary entries and hushed conversations with his generals, the tone was one of mourning. He knew that the British Empire's influence on the final surrender had just evaporated in a single night of unauthorized American initiative. From that moment on, nothing moved the same way again. The carefully choreographed Operation Plunder became a footnote. When Montgomery finally launched his massive, multi-billion-dollar crossing days later, he found Patton already on the other side, famously pissing into the Rhine and sending back mocking telegrams. The strategic collapse wasn't on the German side. It was within the Allied psyche. Churchill's orders became reactions. His strategy became survival. He spent the next several weeks frantically trying to convince Eisenhower to push for Berlin, desperate to regain some of the leverage Patton had unintentionally gambled away. But the momentum was gone. The Americans realized they didn't need the British grand plan to win. They had the speed, the spirit, and the sheer audacity of men like Patton, who didn't care about the map makers in London. And this wasn't even the worst part. This wasn't just a military decision. It was the moment Churchill realized that power has limits, and that his special relationship with the Americans was a partnership of necessity, not equality. In the final weeks of the war, Churchill admitted to his inner circle that he feared Patton more than he feared the collapsing German army. I know he feared that Patton's unpredictability would provoke a war with the Soviets before the British were ready. He feared that the era of the British Lion was over, replaced by an American era that didn't play by the rules of 19th century diplomacy. What was permanently lost on the banks of the Rhine wasn't just German territory. It was the illusion that London was the center of the world. Churchill's admission behind closed doors was the first eulogy for the British Empire. So we have to ask, was Patton's rogue crossing an act of military genius that saved thousands of lives by ending the war faster? Or was it the ultimate act of ego that destabilized the post-war peace and sidelined the very allies who had stood alone against the darkness in 1940? Churchill viewed it as a betrayal of the grand strategy. Patton viewed it as doing the job while the politicians were still arguing over the wardrobe. Was this leadership under pressure, or the moment judgment failed and ego took the wheel? History has never agreed. The records show the victory, but the diaries show the fear. What do you think? Did Patton win the war, or did he lose the peace? Leave a comment below. This is one argument the history books still haven't settled.